The cold didn't just bite. It gnawed, like teeth on exposed bone. Frost spiderwebbed under worn work boots with every heavy step, the crunching sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The air hung thick, not with fog, but with despair. A low, constant groan vibrated through the metal walls of the holding pens, the sound of hundreds of breaths escaping lungs already resigned to the end. Ammonia stung the eyes, mixed with the sour tang of fierce sweat, and old hay turned to dust. Somewhere, a horse kicked futilely against a steel gate, the hollow clang echoing like a death knell. This wasn't a farm. It was an ending. A place where stories stopped. The New Holland Auction Yard, Pennsylvania. February 1956. Ground zero for broken things. And walking through it, feeling the cold seep into his marrow, was Harry Delayer. Not lost, perhaps, but profoundly adrift. His calloused hands, usually steady on reins or smoothing a horse's flank, felt numb inside his gloves. His eyes, the sharp blue of a winter sky, scanned the crowded pens without really seeing. Grief was a heavy cloak he wore, invisible but suffocating. 6 months. Just 6 months since the world had tilted violently, spilling his youngest son, his bright, laughing Peter, out of it. A sudden fever. A silent house. The vibrant chaos of his large family now held a stillness at its center, a space Peter had filled with boundless energy. Harry had tried to bury himself in work at the Knox School, teaching riding, tending the stables, the familiar rhythms of leather and hay. But the grief was a stubborn burr, clinging deep. He moved through his days, a capable man performing tasks, but the light inside him felt banked, diminished. The joy of horses, his lifelong compass, felt muted, distant, like music heard through thick walls. He wasn't here to buy. Not really. The headmaster needed draft crosses, sturdy types for the beginner riders. Harry was just the hired hand sent to look. Sent to navigate this grim marketplace where value was measured in pounds per dollar, and beauty was irrelevant. He moved past pens of dejected animals, their heads low, coats rough, ribs sometimes visible beneath winter fur. Eyes dull, reflecting the gray concrete and the inevitability of the trucks idling nearby, their exhaust pluming white into the frigid air. The air vibrated with a low-level panic, the shuffling of hooves on concrete, the occasional sharp whinny that sounded more like a scream. Then he stopped. At the back of a pen, waiting its turn to be shoved towards the loading chutes, stood a horse. Not remarkable at first glance. A big, raw-boned gelding, maybe 8 or 9, a muddy dapple-gray coat the color of dirty snow. Tall, over 16 hands, but with a coarse, thick neck and a head that seemed too large, too plain. He wasn't fighting, wasn't pacing, wasn't even looking around. He just stood, utterly still. Head lowered slightly, but not in submission. In watchfulness. Like a sentinel carved from sorrow itself. What caught Harry, what hooked into the numb place inside him and pulled, were the eyes. They were enormous. Dark brown, almost black, deep-set beneath a thick forelock crusted with mud and ice. But it wasn't their size. It was the look in them. An impossible depth. An ancient, weary intelligence. And a sadness so profound it seemed to absorb the bleakness of the entire yard. They weren't dull. They were alive with a quiet, contained anguish. They looked straight at Harry, not pleading, not fearful, but seeing him. Truly seeing him. Through the grime, the defeat, the aura of the slaughterhouse, those eyes held a flicker of something undefeated. Something waiting. Harry felt his breath catch. It wasn't beauty. It was recognition. A silent echo of the hollowness he carried. This horse, this massive creature waiting for the end, radiated a stillness that wasn't resignation. It felt more like endurance. A quiet dignity amidst the squalor. Snowflakes, just starting to fall again, caught on the horse's long eyelashes. He didn't blink them away. Harry moved closer, drawn by an invisible tether. The gelding didn't flinch, didn't shy. He just watched. Harry stopped at the heavy wooden slats of the pen. Close enough to see the matted coat, the old scars tracing faint lines on the gray hide, the worn hooves. Close enough to smell the sweat and dust and underlying scent of horse, surprisingly clean beneath the grime. Close enough to see the intelligence, the weariness, the presence in those dark, liquid eyes. A worn yellow tag was clipped to the gelding's halter. Harry reached through the slats, fingers brushing the cold plastic. The price was scrawled in grease pencil, $80. The price of a few £100 of horseflesh bound for the cannery. Dog food. Glue. The final indignity. A wave of nausea, sharp and unexpected, washed over Harry. Not just pity. Something deeper. A visceral wrongness. This creature, with its watchful eyes and impossible stillness, reduced to a number on a tag. Condemned. Just thrown away. Like discarded furniture. The image of Peter's empty bed flashed, unbidden, a fresh stab of loss. The world felt brutally efficient at discarding things that had stopped being useful, stopped being vibrant. Things that carried the weight of sadness. The auctioneer's nasal drone started up again in the nearby ring, rattling off numbers for another lot. The sound was jarring, intrusive. Harry looked from the $80 tag back to the horse's eyes. The gelding lowered his massive head slightly, his warm breath puffing out in a white cloud that momentarily obscured the tag. His nostrils flared, taking in Harry's scent, wool, leather, pipe tobacco, and the lingering grief that clung to him like frost. He didn't nuzzle, didn't whicker. He just breathed. A slow, deep sigh that seemed to come from the very core of him. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was the sound of existence. Persisting. In this place of endings. Harry's numb fingers curled around the cold wooden slat. His knuckles were white. The practical voice in his head, the one that knew the headmaster's budget, the one that knew this horse was too big, too coarse, too broken for school ponies, shouted its objections. $80 is too much for glue bait. He's too old, too big-boned. Look at his feet. He's seen hard work. Probably a plow horse. Useless for riding. Sentimental fool. Asterisk. But another voice, quieter, deeper, drowned it out. It came from the hollow place inside him, the place that ached for Peter, the place that felt discarded too. It came from the sheer, undeniable presence of this horse's gaze. That look, it wasn't asking for rescue. It was offering what? Witness. Understanding? The snow fell a little harder now, dusting the gelding's broad back, catching in his tangled mane. He stood immobile, a statue carved from sorrow and resilience, his dark eyes locked on Harry's. The ammoniac stench, the clanging gates, the auctioneer's drone. It all seemed to recede, muffled by the falling snow and the intensity of that silent exchange. Harry de Layer, the grieving horseman, adrift in his own winter, looked into the eyes of the $80 horse bound for death. And in that frozen moment, standing in the reeking chill of a slaughterhouse yard, a single, quiet certainty pierced the numbness, sharp and cold and undeniable as the frost cracking beneath his boots. This isn't just a horse. And leaving him here would be like leaving a piece of my own broken heart on the killing floor. The auctioneer's gavel slammed down on another unseen lot. The sound was distant, unimportant. Harry didn't move. The horse didn't move. Snow settled on them both. The decision, unspoken, immense, hung heavy in the frigid air. Not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable. The end of something. Or perhaps, against all reason, the fragile, terrifying beginning. The old truck groaned under the unfamiliar burden, its springs protesting on the rutted farm track leading away from New Holland. The scent of diesel and cold metal couldn't mask the other smell clinging to the air inside the cab. Fear sweat, old manure, and the raw, earthy smell of the massive gray gelding crammed into the makeshift stock trailer rattling behind. Harry gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale against the worn leather. The numbness from the auction yard had cracked, replaced by a low thrum of, what? Dread. Foolishness. The $80 price tag felt like a brand on his conscience. He defied logic, budget, and the headmaster's explicit instructions for draft crosses. He'd bought glue bait. A plow horse. A walking monument to his own unraveling grief. He glanced in the rear-view mirror. Through the slats, he caught only fragmented glimpses. A powerful, mud-caked shoulder shifting uneasily, the flash of a dark, watchful eye. No sound came from the trailer, just the rhythmic clop-clop-clop of hooves on wood and the rattle of chains. That silence felt heavier than any panicked whinny. It was the silence of profound exhaustion, of a creature who had seen too many trucks, too many endings. Back at the Knox School stables, the familiar world felt jarringly bright, almost mocking. Sunlight glinted off clean white fences. Well-bred school ponies poked their heads over stall doors, curious and sleek. Harry backed the trailer into the isolation paddock, a small, bare enclosure away from the main barn, used for new arrivals or sick animals. Practicality warred with the strange pull he'd felt. This horse wasn't safe. He was huge, unknown, carrying the stench of the slaughterhouse and God knew history. He lowered the ramp. The gray gelding didn't surge forward. He stood immobile for a long moment, head low, nostrils flaring as he took in the new scents. Clean hay, pine shavings, the distant tang of the ocean carried on the winter breeze. Then, with a slow, deliberate step, he walked down the ramp. Not skittish, not eager, just moving. He stopped on the hard-packed earth of the paddock, head slightly lowered, not looking at Harry, but not ignoring him either. His massive frame seemed to absorb the weak afternoon sun. The mud on his dappled coat had dried in patches, making him look even more disreputable, like a crumbling statue dragged from a swamp. Harry approached slowly, a halter and lead rope in hand. He moved like he was approaching a storm cloud, with respect and a healthy dose of fear. The horse's ears, previously drooping, flickered minutely towards him. That was all. No pinned ears, no whites of the eyes showing panic. Just awareness. Harry stopped a few feet away, mirroring the stillness. He could hear the horse's breathing now, deep and slow, a rhythmic sigh that seemed to resonate in the quiet air. He could smell him too, not just the auction filth, but underneath, a surprisingly clean, grassy scent, like old meadows. "All right, big fella," Harry murmured, his voice rough and used to speaking softly. "Welcome to wherever this is." He lifted the halter. The horse didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He allowed the leather strap to slide over his thick pole, his enormous head heavy in Harry's hands. Harry's fingers, numb with cold and something else, fumbled with the buckle. He felt the coarse hair, the solid bone beneath. He felt the sheer, overwhelming there-ness of the animal. It wasn't submission. It felt more like permission, a weary allowance. He clipped the lead rope. The gelding lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Harry's directly for the first time since the auction. That look again. That deep, liquid intelligence. That profound sadness, but also a flicker of something else. Assessment. Curiosity. Harry felt utterly transparent under that gaze. It saw the grief etched into his own face, the weariness in his own blue eyes. He led the horse towards a corner of the paddock where a fresh pile of hay waited. The gelding followed with surprising lightness for his bulk, his huge hooves making soft thuds on the earth. He lowered his head to the hay, but instead of tearing into it hungrily, he took a single, delicate mouthful. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, his gaze drifting past Harry, over the fences, towards the distant line of trees. Watching. Always watching. Days bled into weeks, marked by the rhythm of chores and the silent presence in the isolation paddock. Harry named him Snowman, a dark joke born of the muddy gray coat and the bleakness of their meeting. He told himself it was temporary. He'd clean him up, get some weight on him, maybe find him a quiet home as a pasture ornament. Anything but the knacker's truck. He couldn't look into those eyes and imagine that ending again. The cleaning was the first ritual. Harry approached Snowman each morning with a bucket of warm water, a stiff brush, and a currycomb. The first touch of the brush on the mud-caked flank made the big horse tense, a ripple running under his thick skin. Harry paused, hand resting lightly. He didn't speak platitudes. He just breathed, slow and steady. Snowman's ear flicked back towards him. Then, almost imperceptibly, the tension eased. He sighed, a deep exhalation that fogged the cold air. Harry began to brush, working in slow, methodical circles, feeling the layers of grime give way. The mud revealed a surprisingly fine, though coarse, dapple-gray coat beneath. Hidden scars became visible, old nicks and lines telling silent stories of labor, maybe neglect. Harry worked around them carefully. Snowman stood like a mountain. He didn't lean into the grooming like a pleasure-seeking pony. He simply endured it, accepted it. His head remained slightly lowered, eyes half closed, but Harry felt his awareness. He felt the subtle shifts in the horse's weight, the minute adjustments of his hooves. He learned the feel of Snowman's breath against his neck when he bent to work on the massive legs. It was warm, moist, rhythmic, a grounding force in the cold mornings. Harry found himself talking, not to the horse, but near him. Small things. The frost on the fence posts. The stubbornness of the old tractor. The way the light fell through the bare branches of the oak tree. He didn't mention Peter. The name was a stone in his throat. But the absence hung heavy in the quiet spaces between his words. One bitingly cold morning, Harry was currying Snowman's thick neck, working out a particularly stubborn knot of mud and burrs. He was focused, lost in the rhythmic scrape of the comb. Suddenly, a warm puff of air hit his ear. He froze. Snowman had turned his head slightly. His massive muzzle was inches from Harry's shoulder. Not nudging, not biting, just resting there. The warmth was startling. Harry could feel the soft velvet of the horse's nose, the whiskers tickling his jacket collar. He could hear the slow, steady inhale and exhale. He didn't move. Snowman didn't move. It wasn't affection. It wasn't a demand. It felt like proximity, acknowledgement, a silent communication that bypassed words entirely. Harry felt a lump rise in his throat, unexpected and sharp. He closed his eyes for a second, leaning infinitesimally into that warmth. The cold, the grief, the constant ache. It didn't vanish. But for that suspended moment, held in the simple warmth of a horse's breath, it felt shared, bearable. He finished grooming in silence. The air between them changed. Later that day, he brought Snowman an apple core. The big horse took it delicately from his palm, his lips surprisingly soft. His enormous teeth crunched the treat with surprising quietness. He didn't nuzzle for more. He simply watched Harry, a piece of apple peel clinging comically to his lower lip. Harry huffed a sound that was almost a laugh. The first in months. It felt strange in his chest, like cracking ice. The headmaster, Mr. Johnson, arrived one afternoon, his polished brogues crunching on the gravel path. He surveyed Snowman in the paddock with a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed dismay. The gelding, cleaner now but still undeniably coarse, massive and plain, stood near the fence, gazing towards the riding ring where a lesson was in progress. "Harry," Mr. Johnson began, his tone carefully neutral. "He's imposing. Cleaned up well, I suppose. But really, what are we going to do with him? He's hardly suitable for the children. Too big. Too—" He gestured vaguely at Snowman's plain head, his thick neck. "Unyielding." Harry bristled, an unfamiliar protectiveness flaring. "He's gentle, sir. Quiet as a lamb. Just needs time. Time costs money, Harry. Feed. Face. We needed reliable mounts, not a projects." Mr. Johnson sighed. "Give him another month. See if he's even rideable. If not—" He left the sentence hanging, the unspoken alternative chillingly clear. The pressure tightened like a cinch around Harry's chest. He knew the headmaster was right, practically. But the thought of Snowman facing that truck again, it felt like a physical blow. He walked towards the paddock fence, kneading the solidity of wood beneath his hands. Snowman ambled over, drawn by Harry's presence or perhaps just the movement. He stopped a few feet away, lowering his head to snuffle at a patch of frozen grass. Harry reached out, resting his hand on the horse's thick neck. The warmth seeped through his glove. Snowman didn't react, continuing his idle sniffing. "He doesn't belong here, Harry," Mr. Johnson said quietly from behind him. "Some creatures, they just don't fit." The words landed with the weight of truth, echoing Harry's own feelings of displacement since Peter's death. He looked into Snowman's deep, dark eye. The horse lifted his head, meeting his gaze. That profound stillness was there, but something else flickered now. A question, a shared understanding of being the misfit. Harry's throat tightened. He patted the solid neck. "We'll see," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. Later, needing to prove something, Harry decided to move Snowman into an empty stall in the main barn. It was time. The isolation paddock felt like a quarantine, a constant reminder of his uncertain status. He led the big gray towards the stable block. Snowman walked calmly beside him, his hooves clopping softly on the path. They reached the wide doorway leading into the warm, hay-scented dimness of the barn aisle. Harry stepped forward, expecting Snowman to follow. He didn't. Harry felt the lead rope go taut. He turned. Snowman had planted his huge front hooves firmly on the threshold. He wouldn't cross. His head was up, ears pricked sharply forward, not pinned back in fear, but rigid with intense focus. His nostrils flared wide, sucking in the barn air. His dark eyes scanned the shadowed aisle, the row of stalls, with laser-like intensity. A low, almost inaudible rumble vibrated deep in his chest. Not a growl. More like a warning hum. The watchfulness Harry had seen at the auction was back, amplified tenfold. It wasn't fear of the building. It was like he was searching for something, or recoiling from a memory embedded in the very air. "Come on, big fella," Harry coaxed, gently tugging the rope. "It's warm. Good hay." Snowman didn't budge. He shifted his weight slightly, muscles bunching under his gray coat. His gaze swept the barn again, lingering for a fraction longer on a stall halfway down, an empty stall with a slightly crooked door. He blew out a sharp, forceful breath through his nostrils, puffing dust motes dancing in a shaft of sunlight. The message was clear: no. Frustration warred with a dawning unease in Harry. Why this resistance? What did he sense? What did he know about this barn that Harry didn't? He tried again, stepping further inside, making encouraging noises. Snowman took one hesitant step forward, his hoof touching the concrete aisle floor, then immediately pulled back as if burned. He tossed his head, a rare sign of agitation, his mane flying. The look he gave Harry wasn't defiance. It was something closer to pleading. "Don't make me go in there." Harry stared at the horse, then back into the barn, seeing it suddenly through Snowman's eyes. The familiar smells of leather, hay, horse, and liniment felt suddenly charged with an unknown history. That empty stall. Had another horse lived there? Died there? Was it a place of pain? Snowman's reaction wasn't skittishness. It was visceral, specific, loaded with an unspoken story. A story Harry desperately needed to understand. He couldn't force him. Not with that look in his eyes. "All right," Harry sighed, the word heavy with surrender and burgeoning questions. "All right, boy. Outside it is." He turned Snowman away from the doorway. The tension immediately bled from the big horse's frame. His head lowered, his breathing slowed. He nudged Harry's shoulder gently with his muzzle. Not a demand, but a quiet, unmistakable thank you. Harry led him back towards the paddock, his mind churning. The $80 horse, the misfit, the creature bound for glue, had just drawn a line in the sand. And Harry, adrift in his own grief, had inexplicably chosen to stand on the horse's side of it. He secured Snowman back in his paddock, refilled the water trough, and forked fresh hay into the rack. The gelding ambled over and began to eat with his usual deliberate slowness. Harry leaned on the fence, watching. The winter sun was low, casting long, cold shadows. The wind sighed through the pines. He felt exhausted, confused, but also tethered to this massive, plain, deeply mysterious animal who saw things he couldn't. Hours later, long after dark, Harry walked back from locking up the main barn. The farm was quiet, bathed in moonlight that turned the frost on the grass to silver. He headed towards his small cottage on the edge of the school property. As he approached his porch steps, a movement in the paddock caught his eye. He stopped. Snowman wasn't by the hay rack. He wasn't sheltering near the leeward fence. He was standing at the paddock gate closest to Harry's cottage. His massive gray form was a silhouette against the moonlit field, head held high, ears pricked forward. He was perfectly still, not pacing, not calling out, just standing, watching Harry's cottage. His dark eyes, reflecting the moonlight, seemed fixed on Harry's bedroom window. Waiting, keeping watch. Harry stood frozen on the path, the cold forgotten. The horse wasn't confined by the paddock fence in that moment. He was choosing to be there, choosing to stand sentinel in the freezing night. His gaze fixed on the home of the man who had bought him for $80 and defied a barn doorway for him. It wasn't loyalty earned. Not yet. It was something more primal. An alignment. A silent declaration. You are mine to watch over. Harry Delayer, the grieving horseman who had felt utterly alone in a house full of family, looked at the $80 horse standing guard in the moonlight. And for the first time since the world shattered, he didn't feel entirely adrift. He felt seen. And inexplicably, impossibly, guarded. The quiet certainty that had begun at the slaughterhouse deepened, settling into his bones like the winter cold. This was no longer just about saving a horse. Something profound, fragile, and utterly real was being woven in the silent space between them, thread by invisible thread. The connection wasn't loud. It was the sound of hooves standing still on frozen ground, the rhythm of breath visible in the cold air, the weight of a watchful gaze in the dark. It was just beginning. Spring arrived on Long Island not with a fanfare, but with a slow, damp sigh. The frost relinquished its grip on the paddock fence posts, leaving dark, wet rings. Mud replaced the hard-packed earth, sucking at boots and hooves. The air still held a bite, but it carried new scents now. Wet earth, the faint green promise pushing through dead grass, and the salty tang of the nearby Sound carried on freshening breezes. Snowman's coat, diligently curried by Harry's hands day after day, had transformed. The muddy gray was now a clean, shimmering dapple, the coarse hair revealing a surprising sheen in the weak sunlight. He'd filled out, the hollows behind his ribs smoothing, his massive frame no longer gaunt but powerfully substantial. Yet, the watchfulness remained. It wasn't fear. It was vigilance. Harry found himself drawn to the paddock not just for chores, but for the quiet. The simple act of leaning on the fence rail, watching Snowman graze with deliberate, thoughtful bites, became a balm. The horse would often lift his head, not startled, but acknowledging Harry's presence with a soft puff of breath or a slow blink of those deep, dark eyes. Sometimes he'd amble over, not demanding attention, but standing companionably close, his warm side radiating heat against Harry's arm through his jacket. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a language. Harry found himself murmuring fragments of his day, bits of frustration with a stubborn tractor, observations about the sky. Still no mention of Peter. The name remained a locked door deep inside. But the weight of that absence felt shared. Held, somehow, in Snowman's immense, quiet presence. The headmaster's ultimatum hung over them, a dark cloud Mr. Johnson pointedly referenced every week. Any progress, Harry? Found a use for him yet? Feed bills mounting. The pressure was a constant low hum beneath the surface calm. Harry knew he needed to try riding Snowman. It was the only justification he could offer. The thought filled him with a strange mix of dread and reluctant hope. Snowman was calm, yes, but his sheer size, the latent power coiled in that thick neck and deep chest, was intimidating. And there was the barn door. Snowman still refused to set hoof inside the main stable. Harry had tried again, coaxing, leading, even tempting him with a bucket of sweet grain. The result was always the same. Snowman planting his hooves firmly on the threshold, head high, ears rigidly forward, nostrils flaring as he scanned the interior. His gaze inevitably locking onto stall 7, the one with the slightly crooked door. That low, resonant hum would vibrate in his chest, a sound that wasn't aggression, but profound, deep-seated unease. He wouldn't panic, wouldn't rear. He would simply refuse. His body became an immovable mountain. The look in his eyes wasn't defiance aimed at Harry. It was a silent plea. Not there. Please, not there. The mystery of stall 7 gnawed at Harry. He'd examined it countless times. Just an empty stall, smelling faintly of old pine shavings and disinfectant. He'd asked old-timers at the school, stable hands who'd been there for years. Shrugs. Just a stall, Harry. Maybe a horse died there once. They all do, eventually. No specifics. No stories. Yet Snowman knew. He reacted to that space with a specificity that was chilling. It wasn't a fear of enclosed spaces. He'd walk calmly into the small, isolated wash stall Harry used for grooming. It was that stall. The crooked door was a landmark in some internal map of pain Harry couldn't decipher. One crisp Saturday morning, desperation nudged Harry into action. He needed to see if Snowman could be ridden, even just walked around the paddock. He brought out an old, stout saddle, built for draft crosses, and a heavy bridle. Snowman watched him approach with a tack, his ears flicking with mild curiosity. He stood patiently as Harry heaved the saddle onto his broad back, tightening the girth incrementally, watching for any sign of discomfort. There was none. He accepted the bit calmly, his large jaw working it thoughtfully. Harry led him to the mounting block, his own heart pounding against his ribs. This was the moment. Would this gentle giant accept a rider? Or would the hidden history, the watchfulness, erupt? He swung his leg over. Snowman stood rock solid. Harry settled into the saddle, the worn leather creaking softly. He felt the immense power beneath him, the living warmth, the slow rise and fall of Snowman's barrel as he breathed. He gathered the reins, gentle pressure. Walk on, boy. Snowman walked. Not the plodding gait Harry half expected, but a smooth, ground-covering stride that felt surprisingly light for his bulk. Harry guided him in slow circles around the paddock. Snowman responded to the slightest shift in weight, the softest touch of the rein. He felt balanced, willing. Harry's initial tension began to ease, replaced by a dawning sense of awe. This horse, bought for dog food, moved with a quiet, innate dignity. He wasn't flashy, but there was a solidity, an unflappable calm, that was deeply reassuring. Hope, fragile but bright, flickered in Harry's chest. Maybe, just maybe. The flicker caught fire, unexpectedly, through Harry's 8-year-old daughter, Sharon. Drawn by the massive, gentle gray, she'd started hanging around the paddock fence after school. One afternoon, she scrambled over the rails before Harry could stop her. "Daddy, he's so big. Can I pet him?" Harry held his breath. Snowman, grazing nearby, lifted his head. He saw the small figure approaching, not with suspicion, but with that same deep, watchful curiosity. Sharon stopped a few feet away, holding out a trembling hand clutching a lump of sugar. Snowman stretched his neck, his soft muzzle reaching for the offering. He lipped the sugar delicately from her palm, his whiskers tickling her skin. Sharon giggled, the sound bright and clear in the spring air. Snowman's ear swiveled towards the sound. He lowered his head slightly, snuffling her hair. From that day on, Sharon became Snowman's shadow. Harry, seeing the horse's gentle patience, cautiously allowed her to sit in the saddle while he led Snowman around the paddock. Snowman adjusted his stride, becoming even more deliberate, more careful. He seemed to understand the preciousness of his small cargo. He'd turn his head slightly, his dark eye keeping track of Sharon, ensuring her balance. When she chattered to him, telling him about school, about her friends, about missing Peter in small, heartbreakingly honest bursts Harry himself couldn't voice. Snowman would flick an ear, or blow a soft, warm breath against her leg. It wasn't comprehension of words, Harry knew. It was comprehension of her. Her small weight, her high voice, her open heart. He became her silent guardian. One afternoon, Harry set up a small crossrail in the paddock, 2 poles barely a foot off the ground. He led Snowman towards it at a walk. The horse's stride didn't falter. He stepped over the poles with the casual ease of stepping over a puddle, barely altering his rhythm. Harry tried a trot. Again, effortless. He raised the poles slightly. Snowman flowed over them, his powerful hindquarters pushing off the ground with surprising spring. Harry felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated excitement. There was athleticism here. Raw, untapped potential hidden beneath the plain exterior and the quiet demeanor. He started riding Snowman properly, venturing beyond the paddock onto the school's hacking trails. Snowman proved sure-footed, calm, and possessed of an engine that, once engaged, could cover ground with surprising speed and smoothness. He wasn't hot or spooky. He was confident, almost serene. Harry began to dream. Faintly, cautiously. Could this horse jump? Not just cross rails, but real fences? The idea was absurd, laughable. A plow horse? A slaughterhouse rescue? But the feel of him, the power and the balance. It whispered of possibilities Harry dared not fully voice. The dream solidified, then shattered, in the span of a single afternoon. Mr. Johnson, impressed despite himself by Snowman's transformation and calm nature under Sharon's adoration and Harry's developing rides, finally conceded. "All right, Harry. He's earned his keep as a quiet hack. We'll keep him. For Sharon." Relief washed over Harry, warm and profound. The threat of the truck was gone. Snowman was safe. Buoyed by this, Harry decided to push further. He built a small vertical jump in the riding ring, about 2.5 feet high. Nothing for a sport horse, but a significant ask for a horse with no known jumping history. He tacked Snowman up, the familiar ritual now imbued with new hope. Snowman stood quietly, accepting the bit, his gaze calm. Harry mounted and warmed him up, feeling the familiar, powerful stride. He turned towards the small fence, asking for a trot, focusing on a straight approach. 10 strides out. Snowman's ears pricked forward, focused on the obstacle. 5 strides. His rhythm remained steady. 3 strides. Harry closed his legs slightly, preparing for the liftoff. 2 strides. Snowman slammed on the brakes. It wasn't a spook. It wasn't a refusal born of fear or confusion. It was a decision. A hard, deliberate no. He planted his front hooves, digging in, his massive body becoming an immovable wall. Harry lurched forward, saved from going over the neck only by instinct and a handful of mane. Snowman stood rigid, head high, nostrils flared wide. He wasn't looking at the jump. He was staring past it, towards the stable block. Specifically, towards the corner where the main barn sat, stall 7 hidden within. "Easy, boy," Harry gasped, regaining his seat, his heart hammering. "What's wrong?" He urged Snowman forward again, gently. The horse took one reluctant step, then another, his muscles taut as cables. He approached the fence again, his entire demeanor radiating tension. Same result. A hard, immovable stop inches from the poles. His dark eyes were wide, showing a crescent of white. That low hum vibrated deep in his chest, louder than Harry had ever heard it. It wasn't directed at Harry. It was aimed at the unseen memory, the ghost tied to that barn, to that stall. The jump, Harry realized with a sickening drop in his stomach, wasn't the problem. It was the direction. Jumping meant moving towards the barn, towards the source of that deep, ingrained dread. Harry dismounted, bewildered and frustrated. Why now? Why this? The refusal was absolute, emanating from a place Harry couldn't reach. He led Snowman away from the jump, the horse's tension easing only slightly, his head turning constantly to keep the barn in his sightline. The dream of jumping, the fragile hope of proving Snowman's worth beyond just being Sharon's gentle giant, felt like it had hit a brick wall. A wall built from secrets Snowman couldn't speak. The unease deepened a week later. A visitor arrived at the school, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, a former groom who'd worked at Knox decades earlier, touring the grounds for nostalgia. He walked with Harry around the stable yard, reminiscing about horses long gone. They paused near the paddock where Snowman grazed, his dappled coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. Mr. Henderson squinted, then his bushy white eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be dipped," he muttered, his voice raspy. "Is that?" "Nah, couldn't be. But looks mighty familiar." Harry's pulse quickened. "Familiar? You recognize him?" "Looks just like a jumper we had here." "Oh, must be 15, 16 years back now. Big gray Dutch warmblood cross. Powerful thing. Name was Buddy. Oh, Banner. Something like that. Talented, but troubled." "Troubled how?" Harry asked, his voice tight. Mr. Henderson scratched his chin. "Nervous. Spooky. Especially in the barn. Hated one particular stall. Stall 7, I think it was. Had a real bad accident in there. Got cast, trapped against the wall, panicked, busted himself up real bad. Never was the same after. Went sour. Wouldn't jump. Started refusing. Became downright dangerous. Owner sold him off quick. Probably to the killers. Poor devil. Cheaper than vet bills." He shook his head sadly. "Shame. He had the heart of a lion before that. Just broke him." He peered closer at Snowman. "But this fella's too calm. That one was a live wire. Probably just a resemblance. Lots of big grays." He patted Harry's arm and moved on, leaving Harry rooted to the spot, ice flooding his veins. Buddy. Banner. The name hung in the air. Stall 7. Accident. Cast. Sour. Killers. The words slammed into Harry like physical blows. He stared at Snowman, who had lifted his head and was looking directly at him. The watchfulness was intense, almost questioning, as if he sensed the shift in Harry, the dawning horror. Harry walked slowly towards the paddock gate. Snowman ambled over to meet him. Harry reached out, his hand trembling slightly, not to pat the neck, but to gently part the thick hair on Snowman's left shoulder, near the withers. He'd noticed faint, parallel scars there before, old and healed, assuming they were from ill-fitting tack. Now, under his searching fingers, he felt not just scars, but a subtle, uneven ridge beneath the skin. A healed fracture? The remnants of a shattered shoulder blade? His fingers traced lower, finding more thickened tissue along the ribs. Injuries consistent with a terrible, panicked struggle. Injuries sustained, trapped against a stall wall. He looked into Snowman's deep, dark eyes. The profound sadness he'd always seen there now held a new layer of meaning. It wasn't just the sadness of the slaughterhouse. It was the deeper, older sorrow of a creature who had known trust, known purpose, known the soaring joy of jumping, and then known betrayal, agony, and the crushing weight of being discarded as dangerous when fear became his only defense. The refusal at the jump wasn't stubbornness. It was terror. A terror anchored in that stall, in the memory of being trapped, helpless, broken. Jumping wasn't just an obstacle. It was a potential pathway back to that unbearable pain. Snowman lowered his massive head, his muzzle touching Harry's chest gently. It wasn't a nuzzle for treats. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability. A silent confession. Yes, it was me. That broken horse. That horse no one wanted. Harry wrapped his arms around the horse's thick neck, burying his face in the warm, dappled fur. He didn't speak. Words were useless. The grief he felt wasn't just for Peter anymore. It was for the suffering etched into the horse he held, for the years of fear and misunderstanding, for the talent that had been buried under trauma. The $80 horse wasn't just a misfit. He was a survivor of a different kind of slaughter. And the barn Harry had tried to lead him into wasn't just a building. It was the chamber of his nightmares. The connection between them shifted, deepening into something raw and painful. The quiet peace of the paddock was gone, replaced by the heavy weight of shared understanding and a terrifying question. How do you heal a wound that deep? How do you ask a horse to fly again when the memory of falling is branded into his bones? The fragile hope of the jump course lay in ruins, replaced by the daunting, jagged landscape of Snowman's hidden past. The journey forward wasn't about proving worth anymore. It was about navigating a minefield of memory, one cautious, terrifying step at a time. The mystery of Stall 7 was solved, but the solution brought only a deeper, more profound kind of tension. The battle wasn't against the headmaster or the jump. It was against the ghost in the gray horse's mind. Harry didn't remember leading Snowman back to the paddock. One moment he was tracing the ridges of old bone beneath the dappled fur. The next he was latching the gate, the cold metal biting into his palm. The world felt muffled, distorted. The cheerful shouts of students in the distant riding ring, the chirp of a robin in the awakening maple tree, the familiar creak of the barn door swinging on its hinges. All sound seemed filtered through thick glass. Inside him, a storm raged, silent and vast. The grief for Peter, a constant companion he'd learned to carry like a stone in his pocket, had suddenly metastasized. It wasn't just his own loss anymore. It was the phantom pain radiating from the massive gray horse standing motionless beside him, head lowered, his breath fogging the cool spring air in short, shallow puffs. Banner. The name was a jagged shard in Harry's mind. Trapped. Broken. Discarded. Mr. Henderson's words echoed, relentless, probably to the killers. And somehow, through the brutal lottery of fate, Banner hadn't ended there. He'd endured years more, years of labor, neglect, the slow erosion of spirit, the final indignity of the New Holland auction yard. Reduced to $80. Reduced to Snowman. The watchfulness Harry had always sensed wasn't just wariness. It was the hypervigilance of a creature who knew the world could shatter him again at any moment. The refusal to enter the barn, the refusal to jump towards it, it wasn't stubbornness. It was the pure animal instinct to flee the epicenter of his deepest terror. Harry leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the paddock fence. The solidity felt illusory. He closed his eyes, but all he saw was the image his mind conjured. A powerful gray horse, young and perhaps fiery, trapped on his back in the dark confines of Stall 7, legs thrashing against unyielding wood, the crack of bone, the scream of pure, unadulterated equine terror. The pain. The helplessness. The betrayal of a space meant for safety becoming a prison of agony. And afterwards, the slow realization that the body that had soared over jumps now faltered. The spirit that had perhaps loved the work now recoiled in fear. Sold off. Labeled dangerous. Worthless. A sound escaped Harry's throat, raw and choked. Not a sob, but the guttural scrape of anguish being dragged over broken glass. He pressed the heels of his hands hard against his closed eyelids, trying to push the images away, but they only intensified, merging with his own private reel of horror. Peter's flushed face the night the fever spiked, the terrifying stillness of the hospital room, the suffocating silence of the house when they returned without him. The feeling of being utterly, irrevocably broken. The world moving on, demanding functionality, while inside, a vital part of you was screaming, trapped in the dark stall of grief. Discarded. The word resonated with terrifying clarity. That's how he'd felt. That's how Banner must have felt. Two broken things, thrown onto the scrap heap of other people's convenience. Harry had clung to routine, to work, building walls of competence around the raw wound. Banner had built walls of fear. Different defenses, same desolation. He turned his head, his cheek scraping against the splintered wood. Snowman hadn't moved. He stood a few feet away, his enormous head hanging low, the thick forelock obscuring his eyes. His breathing was still shallow, rapid. His entire massive frame seemed coiled, vibrating with a tension that mirrored Harry's own. He wasn't grazing. He wasn't watching the birds. He was simply existing in the aftershock of Harry's discovery. The horse who had witnessed Harry's grief from the periphery, who had offered silent companionship, now stood beside him, radiating his own profound, ancient sorrow. The shared space between them wasn't just air. It was thick with the ghosts of their separate, yet parallel, tragedies. The pressure built in Harry's chest, a physical ache expanding beneath his ribs. It wasn't just sadness. It was a tidal wave of rage, at the careless owner who sold a traumatized horse to slaughter, at the indifferent auction system, at the universe that allowed children to die and horses to suffer such pointless agony. But mostly, it was rage at the sheer, isolating loneliness of carrying such pain. He'd been drowning for months, and no one truly saw it. Not his wife, bless her, trying to hold the family together. Not his other children, lost in their own confusion. He was Harry, the strong one, the horseman. Expected to function. Expected to endure. Just like Banner had been expected to perform, then discarded when he couldn't. He pushed himself violently away from the fence. He needed air. He needed something. He stumbled towards the stable block, not thinking, just moving. He bypassed the main barn entrance, the sight of those doors now a physical repulsion, a reminder of the dark chamber within. He headed instead for the small, cluttered storage room tucked behind the tack room. It smelled of dust, old leather oil, and forgotten things. He needed a saddle soap, or a rag. Anything to occupy his hands, to stop the trembling. He yanked open the door, the hinges protesting. The single, grimy window offered little light. He fumbled for the pull chain of the bare bulb overhead. The weak yellow light flickered on, illuminating shelves crammed with dusty bridles, cracked buckets, tins of dried-out hoof dressing, and stacks of old horse magazines. His gaze swept desperately over the chaos. Saddle soap, saddle soap. His eyes snagged on a corner of something sticking out from beneath a pile of moldering horse blankets. Not leather. Something woven. Something faded. Driven by a compulsion he didn't understand, Harry shoved the heavy blankets aside. Dust motes exploded into the air, dancing in the feeble light. It was a box. An old, wooden tack trunk, scarred and stained, the brass fittings green with tarnish. It wasn't school property. It looked decades older than anything else here. It must have been left behind by some long-gone student or trainer. Harry hadn't noticed it before, buried as it was. He crouched down, his knees cracking, the dusty floor gritting under his boots. The latch was stiff, rusted shut. He wrestled with it, fingers slipping, frustration adding fuel to the internal firestorm. With a final, grating screech, the latch gave way. He lifted the lid. The smell that wafted out wasn't dust. It was the faint, lingering scent of liniment, hay, and something else. The ghost of horse sweat, perhaps. And leather. Inside, neatly folded but clearly untouched for years, lay a set of show gear. Not the utilitarian tack of the Knox School. This was different. Finer. A supple, dark brown jumping saddle, well-worn but lovingly cared for once. A bridle with braided reins and a flash noseband. And carefully coiled beside them, a set of show braids, intricate, precise plaits woven with faded blue and white ribbons. The colors of what stable? What forgotten champion? Harry's breath hitched. His hand, seemingly of its own accord, reached out and lifted the coil of braids. The yarn ribbons were brittle, the horsehair dulled by time, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. Someone had taken immense care. He ran his thumb over the intricate weave, feeling the slight coarseness of the hair beneath the ribbons. Then, tucked inside the coil, a small slip of paper fluttered out. It landed on the dusty floor of the storage room. Harry picked it up. Yellowed. Brittle. The handwriting was elegant, flowing script, faded but still legible. For Banner. My heart horse. May you always fly like you did today. All my love, Ellie. The words blurred. Harry squeezed his eyes shut, then forced them open, staring at the name. Banner. Ellie. My heart horse. Fly. The dam broke. It wasn't a single sob. It was a convulsion. A raw, animal sound ripped from the deepest, darkest place Harry had barricaded. He crumpled to his knees on the dusty floor, the braids clutched in one fist, the note fluttering from the other. The weight of it all, Peter's empty bed, the suffocating loneliness, the image of Banner trapped and screaming, the $80 tag, the profound sadness in Snowman's eyes, the loving words from a girl named Ellie to her heart horse who had known how to fly, crashed over him in an obliterating wave. He wept as he hadn't wept since the day they buried Peter. Great, heaving sobs that racked his frame, tearing at his throat. Tears streamed down his face, carving paths through the grime on his cheeks, dripping onto the faded ribbons and the dusty floor. He gasped for air, the sound ragged and broken in the confined space. It was the grief of a father, the grief of a horseman confronted with senseless suffering, the grief of a man who felt irreparably shattered, poured out onto the forgotten relics of another broken creature's glorious past. He didn't know how long he knelt there, lost in the storm. Time dissolved into the raw physicality of his anguish. When the worst tremors finally subsided, leaving him hollowed out and trembling, he became aware of a presence. Not in the room. Outside. He lifted his head, his vision swimming. He hadn't closed the storage room door. Through the open doorway, across the short stretch of gravel yard, he saw him. Snowman. The big gray horse stood pressed against the paddock fence closest to the storage room. He wasn't grazing. He wasn't looking around. His massive head was stretched over the top rail, neck arched, his dark eyes fixed unwaveringly on the doorway where Harry knelt. He was utterly still, utterly focused. His nostrils flared slightly, as if trying to catch Harry's scent on the air. His ears were pricked rigidly forward, not a flicker of distraction. He looked like a sentinel, like a lifeline cast across the distance. Harry stared back, his breath still hitching. He saw the horse, truly saw him, not as Snowman the Project, or Banner the Tragic Jumper, but as a mirror reflecting his own fractured soul. The profound sadness in those deep eyes wasn't just Banner's memory. It was the universal sorrow of loss, of trust betrayed, of potential crushed. The watchfulness wasn't just vigilance. It was the shared language of survivors. They were both creatures who had known soaring heights and crushing depths, who carried invisible fractures, who had been discarded, and who, against all odds, were still here. Still breathing. Still standing. A profound stillness settled over Harry, deeper than the preceding storm. The tears still wet on his face, the note and braids in his hands, the dust of forgotten years on his knees. None of it mattered in the face of that unwavering gaze. Snowman wasn't offering solutions. He wasn't demanding anything. He was simply present, witnessing Harry's breakdown with the same quiet, unflinching acceptance Harry had offered him in the paddock during grooming. The horse who feared the barn was standing guard at its periphery, refusing to look away from the man breaking inside it. Harry slowly, shakily, pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, but the crushing weight had shifted. Not gone, but shared, distributed. He walked to the doorway, the braids and notes still clutched in his hand. He stopped on the threshold, the weak afternoon sun warming his face after the gloom of the storage room. Snowman didn't move, didn't whinny. He simply held Harry's gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his massive head. Not in submission, in acknowledgement. A silent bow across the space between them. Harry took a step forward, then another. He crossed the gravel yard, the small stones crunching under his boots, the only sound in the charged silence. He stopped at the paddock fence, directly in front of Snowman. He reached up, his hand trembling only slightly now, and placed it flat against the horse's broad forehead, just between the eyes. The skin was warm, velvety soft. He felt the solid bone beneath, the steady pulse of life. Snowman closed his eyes. A long, deep sigh shuddered through his massive frame, starting at his withers and flowing down his body to his hooves. It was the sound of tension releasing, of a burden momentarily eased. He leaned his head infinitesimally into Harry's touch. A silent surrender. A profound trust offered across the chasm of their shared pain. Harry leaned his own forehead against the horse's, closing his eyes. He breathed in the scent of horse, hay, and the faint salt tang of his own dried tears. He felt the solid warmth, the slow heartbeat, the undeniable aliveness of the creature before him. The braids and the note were still in his other hand, a tangible link to Banner's past joy and pain. But in this moment, holding the horse who had become Snowman, who carried Banner's scars and his own unbearable grief, Harry Delayer finally understood. He wasn't just healing a horse. He was standing face to face with his own brokenness, reflected in the deep, dark eyes of a $80 cast-off. And in that silent communion, kneeling in the dust of memory and standing in the spring sunlight, something fractured inside him began, slowly, impossibly, to knit. Not healed, not whole, but no longer alone in the dark stall. The breaking point wasn't an ending. It was the raw, necessary opening of a door he'd kept bolted shut for too long. The journey forward wasn't about jumping fences anymore. It was about learning how to breathe again, side by side, with the ghosts whispering at their backs. He lifted his head, his hand still resting on Snowman's forehead, his voice a raw whisper that blended with the horse's soft breath. "We're both still here, big fella," he murmured. "We're both still here." The morning after the storm was soft, not with sunshine, but with a slow silver drizzle that blurred the edges of the paddock fence, the stable roof, the distant line of trees. The world felt hushed, as if holding its breath. Harry stood on the porch of his cottage, a steaming mug of coffee cradled between his hands, the heat seeping into his palms. He wasn't thinking. Not really. Just existing in the quiet. His eyes were raw, his body heavy with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from labor, but from the unraveling of something long held tight. Across the wet yard, Snowman stood in the paddock, his dappled gray coat darkened by the rain. He wasn't grazing, wasn't pacing, just standing. Head slightly lowered, ears relaxed, his breath making faint clouds in the damp air. He looked peaceful. Not happy. Horses didn't work like that, but present. As if the weight of yesterday's revelation had settled into him, not as a burden, but as a fact. A scar, not a wound. Harry took a slow sip of coffee. The bitterness grounded him. He studied the horse, Banner, he corrected silently, and felt none of the old frustration about the jumping refusal, the barn door, the mystery. The mystery was solved. The refusal made sense. And in that understanding, something had shifted. Not fixed, not erased, but acknowledged, shared. He set the mug down on the porch rail and stepped out into the drizzle. The rain was fine, misting against his face, dampening his shirt. He didn't hurry. Just walked, boots sinking slightly into the softening earth, until he reached the paddock gate. Snowman lifted his head at Harry's approach, ears flicking forward. Not wary, just aware. Harry unlatched the gate and stepped inside. The mud sucked at his boots. Snowman watched him, dark eyes steady. No halter in Harry's hands. No treats. No agenda. Just the space between them, damp and quiet. He stopped an arm's length away. Snowman's nostrils flared, taking in his scent. Coffee, wool, rain, the lingering salt of last night's tears. Then, slowly, the big horse stretched his neck and lowered his head, his muzzle hovering just above Harry's chest. Not touching, not demanding, just there. A question, an offering. Harry exhaled. He lifted his hand and rested it on the damp fur of Snowman's neck, just below the tangled mane. The warmth of the horse's body seeped into his fingers, a living, breathing anchor. No words. No grand declarations. Just the rain, the silence, and the quiet understanding that some wounds don't heal clean. They scar. They reshape you. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you find someone, human or horse, who carries their own scars in a way that makes yours feel less jagged. The days that followed were not miraculous. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no soaring jumps, no Hollywood moments where Banner, Snowman, shook off his past and became the horse he'd once been. But there were small things. Harry stopped trying to force the barn. Instead, he set up a makeshift grooming station under the old oak tree in the paddock, where Snowman could stand in the open air while Harry curried the mud from his coat, picked out his hooves, braided his mane with clumsy fingers. The big horse tolerated it all with his usual quiet patience, though Harry noticed his ears would still flick toward the barn whenever a door slammed or a voice echoed from inside. Sharon, oblivious to the deeper currents, continued her adoration. She'd scramble onto Snowman's back bareback, her small hands buried in his mane, chattering about school and friends and how one day she'd ride him in a real show. Snowman, to Harry's quiet amazement, adjusted his stride to her, careful and deliberate, as if he understood the preciousness of his small rider. And then, one evening, as Harry sat on the paddock fence watching the sunset bleed orange across the sky, Snowman did something unexpected. He walked to the center of the paddock, where Harry had left a single, low crossrail set up from an earlier lesson. He stopped in front of it, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Harry held his breath. Snowman exhaled, long and slow. Then, without prompting, without a rider, he gathered himself and hopped over the tiny jump. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't the soaring leap of a champion. It was a casual, almost lazy hop, as if he'd simply decided to step over a puddle. But it was voluntary. Harry's throat tightened. He didn't cheer, didn't rush forward with praise. He just nodded, as if Snowman had told him something important. And maybe he had. Harry didn't tell anyone about the note. For Banner, my heart horse. Ellie's words stayed folded in his pocket, a secret between him and the horse. But it gnawed at him. Who was Ellie? Where was she now? Had she ever known what happened to her heart horse? One afternoon, while Sharon was at school and the stable was quiet, Harry took the note to the school's office and dug through old records. The Knox School had been around for decades. If Ellie had been a student here, there might be traces. It took hours. Dusty yearbooks, faded enrollment logs, boxes of forgotten paperwork. But finally, buried in a ledger from 1948, he found it. Ellie Carmichael. Boarded gray gelding. Banner. Advanced jumper. Withdrawn June 1949. No explanation. No forwarding address. Just a gone. Harry sat back, rubbing his temples. He thought of the braids, the careful stitching on the saddle, the love in those words. Ellie had cared. Deeply. And then Banner had been hurt, sold off, erased. He thought of Peter's empty bed. The way grief could make people disappear, too. That night, he didn't go straight home. Instead, he walked to the paddock, where Snowman stood dozing under the moonlight. The horse lifted his head as Harry approached, ears swiveling toward him. Harry reached into his pocket and pulled out the note. He didn't read it aloud. Horses didn't need words. But he held it out, letting Snowman sniff the paper, the ink, the faintest trace of a girl's perfume still lingering after all these years. Snowman's breath was warm against his fingers. Then, slowly, the big horse lowered his head and rested his muzzle against Harry's shoulder. A quiet exhale. A sigh. Harry didn't know if horses remembered. If Banner, somewhere deep inside, still carried the echo of Ellie's voice, her hands braiding his mane, the thrill of flying over jumps together. But in that moment, under the cold moonlight, it didn't matter. The past was past. They were here now. The headmaster stopped asking when Harry would get rid of the plow horse. The other stable hands stopped snickering about the ugly gray giant. Even the school ponies seemed to regard Snowman differently, no longer shying from his size but grazing alongside him as if he'd always been there. And Harry. Harry stopped counting the days since Peter's death. He didn't realize it at first. It wasn't a conscious decision. But one morning, as he forked fresh hay into Snowman's paddock, he caught himself humming. A tuneless, absent sound. The kind of thing you do when you're not thinking about grief. He froze. Then, slowly, he let out a breath and kept working. The rain returned that night, a steady drumming on the stable roof. Harry lay awake in his cottage, listening to it. Somewhere out there, Snowman stood in his paddock, his coat glistening wet, his breath fogging the air. Neither of them were whole. But they weren't broken alone anymore. And that, Harry thought as he closed his eyes, was enough. For now. The clang of the feed bucket against the paddock fence was the same. The creak of the gate hinges, the soft thud of Snowman's hooves on the damp earth, all of it unchanged. Yet everything felt different. Harry dumped the last scoop of grain into the feed tub, watching as Snowman ambled over, his ears flicking forward at the sound. The big horse didn't rush. Never had. He approached with the same deliberate calm he did everything, his nostrils flaring as he inhaled the sweet scent of molasses mixed into the oats. Harry reached out, running a hand along the thick crest of the gelding's neck, fingers brushing the place where the old fracture had healed beneath the dappled coat. Banner's neck. The name didn't matter anymore. Not really. The horse was who he was, both the champion jumper he'd once been and the scarred, steadfast creature he was now. Harry had stopped trying to separate the two. Snowman lipped at the grain, chewing slowly, his dark eyes half-lidded in contentment. The morning sun slanted through the oak leaves, dappling his back with patches of gold. A breeze carried the scent of cut grass from the school's riding ring, where students would soon be tacking up for lessons. Normal. Simple. And then a car door slammed in the driveway. Harry turned, squinting against the sun. A sedan he didn't recognize was parked near the stable office, its paint dull with dust. A woman stood beside it, one hand shielding her eyes as she looked around. Something about the way she held herself, the tilt of her head, the hesitation in her step, made Harry's pulse stutter. He set the feed bucket down. Snowman lifted his head, ears pricking toward the stranger. She was older than Harry by a decade, maybe more. Her hair, once dark, was streaked with silver, pulled back in a neat braid. Her hands were weathered, the hands of someone who had worked hard and wasn't afraid of dirt. But it was her eyes that caught him, sharp, clear, the color of faded denim. "Can I help you?" Harry called, wiping his palms on his jeans as he approached. The woman turned. For a second, she just looked at him, her gaze flickering past him to the paddock, to the gray horse standing motionless by the fence. Then, softly, "That's him, isn't it?" Harry froze. Her voice was low, steady, but there was something underneath, a rawness, like an old wound pressed. He didn't need to ask who she meant. Snowman hadn't moved. His head was high, his nostrils flared wide, his entire body rigid with a focus Harry had only seen once before, the day he'd refused to enter the barn. The woman took a step forward, then another. Her boots crunched on the gravel. Harry's throat tightened. "Ellie." She didn't answer, didn't even seem to hear him. Her gaze was locked on the horse. Snowman let out a sound. Not a whinny, not a nicker, but a deep, shuddering exhale, the kind that came from the very bottom of a horse's lungs. Then, slowly, he took a step toward the fence. Ellie Carmichael didn't run. She walked, her steps measured, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. When she reached the paddock rail, she stopped, her breath catching. Snowman stood on the other side, close enough that his whiskers brushed the wood. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ellie reached out, slowly, so slowly, and pressed her palm flat against the horse's forehead, right between his eyes. "Hey, Banner," she whispered. And the big gray horse closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. They sat on the porch of Harry's cottage, mugs of tea going cold between them. Ellie's hands curled around hers like she was anchoring herself. "I didn't know," she said, staring at the paddock where Snowman Banner grazed. his ears flicking toward them every few seconds as if to check she was still there. I went to college. My parents sold him while I was gone. Told me he'd gone to a good home. Her mouth twisted. I should have checked. I should have. Harry didn't fill the silence. He just waited. Ellie took a shaky breath. He was my heart horse. You know what that means. Harry nodded. He knew. She looked down at her hands. I came back last month to visit family. Heard rumors about a gray horse at Knox School, some slaughterhouse rescue. I didn't let myself hope. Not until I saw him. Her voice cracked. He's older, heavier, but it's him. I'd know him anywhere. Harry thought of the note, the braids, the way Snowman had refused to enter stall 7. He remembers you, he said quietly. Ellie's eyes filled. He shouldn't. Not after all this time. Not after what happened. Harry leaned forward. What did happen? She swallowed. He got cast. Trapped in that stall. Broke his shoulder, his ribs. They said he'd never jump again. That he was dangerous. A tear slipped down her cheek. I was away at school. By the time I came home, he was gone. The pieces clicked into place. The fear. The refusal. The scars. Harry exhaled. He's not dangerous. Ellie laughed wetly. No. He never was. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, Harry reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note. Ellie went very still. You left this, he said. She took it with trembling fingers, unfolding it carefully, as if afraid it might disintegrate. When she saw the handwriting, her breath hitched. For Banner, my heart horse. May you always fly like you did today. She pressed the paper to her chest, her shoulders shaking. Harry looked away, giving her privacy. His gaze landed on Snowman, who had lifted his head from grazing and was watching them, his dark eyes unreadable. Ellie stayed for a week. She came every morning, her old riding boots dusted off, her hands steady as she brushed Snowman's coat, picked out his hooves, braided his mane with fingers that remembered the patterns. Harry watched them, the way the horse leaned into her touch, the way his ears flicked to catch her voice. It wasn't just memory. It was trust, rekindled. On her last day, Ellie turned to Harry. Will you let me ride him? He didn't hesitate. Yes. They led Snowman to the small jumping ring Harry had set up at the edge of the property. Far from the barn, far from stall 7. The cross rails were low, barely a foot off the ground. Ellie mounted with the ease of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. Snowman stood rock-still beneath her, his ears pricked forward. Harry held his breath. Ellie gathered the reins, touched her heels to the gelding's sides. And Snowman, Banner, moved like he was remembering. His trot was smooth, powerful, his canter effortless. When Ellie turned him toward the first crossrail, he didn't hesitate, didn't balk. He jumped. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the soaring leap of his youth. But it was clean, willing. Ellie let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. She circled him back, patted his neck, then aimed him at the jump again. And again. And again. Harry stood at the rail, his throat tight. He wasn't watching the horse. He was watching Ellie's face. The way her eyes lit up, the way she smiled. Not the sad, wistful smile she'd worn all week, but something brighter. something like joy. When she finally pulled Snowman to a halt, dismounting with a grace that belied her age, her cheeks were wet. "He still flies," she whispered. Harry nodded. Because he did. Not like before, but enough. Ellie left the next morning. She didn't take Snowman with her. "He's yours now," she told Harry, pressing the old braided reins into his hands. "You're the one who brought him back." Harry tried to refuse. "He was yours first." Ellie shook her head. "No. He was himself first. Always was." She reached up, cupping the horse's face in her palms. "Be happy, Banner." Then she turned and walked to her car, her back straight, her step steady. Snowman watched her go. He didn't call out, didn't pace. Just stood, quiet as always, until the dust from her tires settled. Then he turned and nudged Harry's shoulder with his muzzle, his breath warm against his skin, as if to say, "I'm here. We're both still here." That night, Harry sat on the porch, Ellie's reins in his lap, the note tucked safely in his pocket. Sharon curled beside him, her small hands petting the barn cat purring in her lap. "Daddy." "Yeah, kiddo. Is Snowman magic?" Harry looked out at the paddock, where the big gray horse stood silhouetted against the moonlit grass. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think he is. Not because he could jump. Not because he'd been a champion. But because he'd carried his scars without letting them break him. Because he'd waited all those years for someone to see him. Really see him. And in doing so, he'd taught Harry to do the same." Winter came again. The same frost cracked under Harry's boots as he crossed the yard. The same icy wind howled through the stable eaves. The same scent of hay and horse and damp earth clung to the pre-dawn air. But nothing was the same. Snowman stood at the paddock gate, waiting. His dappled coat had thickened against the cold, his breath fogging the air in steady puffs. His dark eyes, deep as old wood, watched Harry approach. 5 years. 5 years since the slaughterhouse. 5 years since the $80 horse had stepped into Harry's life and refused to leave. Harry unlatched the gate, and Snowman nudged his shoulder gently, his whiskers brushing the worn fabric of Harry's jacket. No halter needed. No lead rope. Just trust, worn smooth as an old saddle. They walked together toward the barn, the main barn, the one Snowman had once refused to enter. The crooked door of stall 7 stood open. Snowman hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough for Harry to see the flicker of memory in his eyes. Then he stepped inside. They say a horse can't remember forever. They say time blurs the edges of pain, that animals live in the present, that they don't hold on to the past the way humans do. Maybe that's true. But Harry knew better. Snowman remembered. He remembered the girl who had braided his mane with blue and white ribbons. He remembered the stall where he had thrashed and screamed and broken. He remembered the hands that had pulled him from the slaughter line and given him a name. And he remembered how to fly. Not like before. Not with the fire of youth. But with something deeper. Something quieter. Something that looked a lot like love. Horses don't heal like people. They don't talk about their scars. They don't mourn aloud. They just keep breathing. Keep standing. And if they're lucky, if they're seen, they learn to trust again. Harry had thought, in the beginning, that he was saving Snowman. But it had never been that simple. The $80 horse had saved him right back. They never made it to the big shows. No gleaming trophies, no roaring crowds, No headlines about the slaughterhouse Cinderella. But there were mornings when Harry would saddle Snowman and ride him through the fields, the wind sharp in their faces, the world stretching out ahead. There were afternoons when Sharon, older now but still small, would perch on his back and laugh as he carried her over tiny jumps. His ears pricked forward, his stride steady. And there were evenings, quiet, golden evenings, when Harry would lean against the paddock fence and watch Snowman graze, his coat silver in the fading light, his breath slow and even. No fanfare, no glory, just this. Just a horse who had been broken, and a man who had been lost, and the unspoken promise between them. I see you. You're not alone. People will tell you that rescue stories have happy endings, that the broken thing gets fixed, that the wounds fade, that the past stops hurting. But that's not how it works. Not for horses. Not for people. The scars stay. The memories linger. The real magic isn't in the healing. It's in the choosing to stand up anyway, to trust again, to carry the weight together. Snowman never stopped being Banner. Harry never stopped missing Peter. But they learned, in their own way, how to bear it. And that was enough. The snow fell softly the day Snowman left. Not tragically, not painfully, just quietly, the way old horses do when their time has come. Harry knelt beside him in the straw, one hand resting on the gray neck that had carried him through his darkest years. Snowman's breath slowed, then stopped. And Harry, who had taught himself not to cry, buried his face in the dappled fur and wept. Not for the horse he'd lost, but for the one he'd been given, the one who had taught him how to live again. Years later, on a farm far from Knox School, a gray mare gave birth to a foal, big-boned, plain-faced, with dark, knowing eyes. And when the old stable hand who had come to see the new arrival reached out to touch the colt's forehead, the baby horse leaned into his hand, just for a second, before trotting off to his mother. Harry de Layer smiled, and whispered, soft as the wind, "Hey, Snowman. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below. Who was your favorite character? Did Snowman's journey inspire you? What lessons did you take from this tale? Hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we post a new heartwarming story. Like and subscribe for more real-life legends that will stay with you long after the screen fades. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one else saw coming. Thank you for watching. Until the next story.